A 13-year-old boy walks into a room full of outlaws carrying a notebook that could destroy the most powerful man in town. 47 lies, documented, cataloged, every route, every truck, every disappearing dollar. His father, the man this whole county worships, has been running one of the most sophisticated fraud operations anyone's ever seen. And nobody believed the kid. Not the teachers, not the cops, not the social workers, nobody. Until he pushed open the doors of the Iron Ledger Motorcycle Club and laid that crimson notebook on the table like a grenade with the pin already pulled. What happens next will test every man in that room. Stay with me until the very end of this one. If this story hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. Let's ride. The morning came in gray and mean, the kind of November sky that pressed down on ridgecrests like a hand trying to smother something alive. Frost clung to every surface outside the Iron Ledger clubhouse, the rusted chain-link fence along the property line, the row of Harleys parked nose out beneath the corrugated awning, the cracked concrete where oil stains had soaked so deep they'd become part of the foundation. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee, and old leather, and the faint chemical sting of motor oil that never quite washed out of anything. 2 space heaters hummed in opposite corners of the main room. Neither one did much. Ronan Creed sat at the long wooden table near the back wall, both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had lost its handle 3 years ago. He hadn't slept. The skin under his eyes was the color of a bruise healing wrong, and the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline, a souvenir from Helmand Province 2009, looked sharper in the dim light, like the cold had tightened everything. He was 44 years old, and some mornings he felt every single one of those years stacked inside his chest, like wet sandbags. 3 other members sat scattered around the room. Dex Mercer leaned against the pool table with his laptop balanced on the felt, scrolling through something with the kind of quiet intensity that meant he hadn't come up for air in hours. Dex was 31, rail thin, with glasses he kept pushing up the bridge of his nose, and a neck tattoo of a circuit board that most people mistook for tribal ink. He'd done 4 years at Fort Meade before a dishonorable discharge that he never talked about, and nobody asked about. Whatever he'd done with signals intelligence for the Army, he now did for the club, and he did it better than anyone Ronan had ever known. Across the room, Tommy Briggs and a prospect named Kessler played cards at a folding table, neither one speaking. The only sound, the soft snap of cards hitting plywood and Kessler's occasional cough. Tommy was 62, the oldest patched member, a man who communicated almost entirely through grunts and the angle of his cigarette. He'd buried a wife and a son in the same calendar year and come out the other side not softer but quieter, like a building that had burned down to its frame and just kept standing because no one told it to fall. The front door opened at 7:14 in the morning. Everyone noticed because the door had a particular sound. A groan of swollen wood against the frame that functioned better than any doorbell. Cold air poured in like water filling a hole, and standing in that rectangle of gray daylight was a boy. He was 13, maybe. Thin in the way that suggested he'd been growing fast and eating slow. Brown hair matted from the cold, a jacket 2 sizes too big with one sleeve torn at the shoulder seam, sneakers soaked through from the frost. His face was narrow, serious, carrying an expression that didn't belong on a kid. The flat, measuring look of someone who'd been calculating odds and outcomes for a long time and had already accepted that most of them were bad. In his hands, pressed against his chest like he was shielding it from the wind, was a notebook. Crimson cover, dog-eared corners, a rubber band wrapped around it twice. Nobody moved. The boy stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood there for a moment, scanning the room the way someone scans a new environment when they've learned the hard way that every room has exits and every room has threats. His eyes moved from Tommy to Kessler to Dex to Ronan, and they stopped on Ronan, and something in the boy's posture shifted, not relaxing exactly, but deciding. "I counted 47 lies this week," the boy said. His voice was steady, not loud, not dramatic, just a fact delivered into a room full of men who had spent their lives around violence and loss, and the particular kind of silence that fills the space between a threat and a response. Ronan set his mug down slowly. The ceramic made a dull sound against the table. "Whose lies?" "My father's." The room changed. Not visibly. Nobody stood up, nobody reached for anything, nobody exchanged obvious glances. But the temperature shifted the way it does when a current runs through still water. Everyone was listening now. Even Kessler, who'd been with the club less than 3 months and still flinched at engine backfires, put his cards down. "Who's your father?" Ronan asked. "Grant Voss?" Tommy's cigarette paused halfway to his mouth. Dex looked up from his laptop. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into a well, and everyone waited for the sound it would make when it hit bottom. Grant Voss, director of the Ridgecrest Community Trust. The man whose face appeared on banners at every county fair, every fundraiser, every ribbon-cutting ceremony for every new shelter and food bank and community center within 60 miles. The man the mayor called the conscience of this town. The man the local paper had profiled 3 times in 5 years, always with the same photograph. That handsome, open face, that carefully constructed warmth in his eyes, that smile designed to make you feel like he was listening to you, when what he was really doing was measuring whether you were useful. "Sit down," Ronan said. Not a command, an invitation. The difference mattered, and the boy seemed to recognize it. The kid walked to the table and sat across from Ronan. He placed the notebook between them but kept one hand on it, fingers spread across the crimson cover like he was holding down something that might blow away. "What's your name?" "Elias." "Elias, you want coffee? We've got coffee. It's terrible, but it's hot." For the first time, something flickered across the boy's face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The kind of micro-expression that told Ronan this kid hadn't been offered something simple and kind in a while. "Okay," Elias said. Tommy got up without being asked and poured a mug, brought it over, set it in front of the boy with the careful precision of a man who understood that small gestures carried weight. Elias wrapped both hands around it the same way Ronan held his, for warmth, not taste. "Tell me about the lies," Ronan said. And Elias did, not in a rush, not in tears, not with the scattered desperation of a child seeking attention. He spoke the way someone speaks when they've rehearsed something alone in their room at night, whispering into their pillow, running through the facts over and over until the emotion was stripped away and only the architecture remained. He told them about the trucks. His father's charity operated a fleet of 14 box trucks that were supposed to deliver food, clothing, medical supplies, and building materials to shelters across 3 counties. Elias had watched those trucks for months. He'd stood on the overpass near Route 9 after school, counting. He'd ridden his bike to the distribution center on weekends, sitting in the parking lot of the gas station across the street with a pair of binoculars he'd stolen from the school's science lab. He'd written down license plate numbers, departure times, routes. 7 of the 14 trucks never went to shelters. They went north on Route 9, then west on a county road that dead-ended at a cluster of abandoned agricultural warehouses near the old Garrett farm property. The trucks went in loaded and came out empty, but the shelters those trucks were supposed to supply kept reporting shortages. Elias knew because he'd called them. He'd used the phone at the public library, disguising his voice as best a 13-year-old could, asking simple questions. "Do you have enough blankets? When was your last delivery?" The answers were always the same. "We're behind. We're always behind." "We were told the funding was cut." The funding wasn't cut. Elias knew that too because he'd overheard his father on phone calls, late at night, in the home office with the door closed, speaking in a voice Grant Voss never used in public. No warmth, no performance, just numbers, coordinates, schedules. Coded language that Elias hadn't understood at first, but had learned to decode through sheer repetition and the particular intelligence of a child who has no choice but to become a spy in his own home. Ronan listened without interrupting. He watched the boy's hands, the way the left one stayed on the notebook, protective, proprietary, while the right one occasionally lifted from the coffee mug to gesture, small movements that carried the precision of someone used to being invisible and making the most of the rare moments when someone was actually paying attention. "The notebook," Ronan said when Elias paused. "May I?" Elias hesitated. His fingers tightened on the cover. Then he slid it across the table. Ronan opened it carefully. The pages were filled with small, neat handwriting. the kind of obsessive documentation that would have been impressive from an adult and was something closer to heartbreaking from a child. Dates, times, license plates, names, route descriptions with hand-drawn maps in the margins, surprisingly accurate, marked with X's and arrows, and small notations in a code the boy had invented himself. Columns of numbers that appeared to track inventory discrepancies, fragments of overheard conversations, transcribed phonetically when Elias didn't know the words. On page 37, Ronan found a section that made him stop breathing. 3 words, underlined twice. "Where's Mom?" He looked up at Elias. The boy was staring at the table, jaw tight, the muscles in his thin neck working against something he was trying very hard not to feel. "Your mother," Ronan said. Lena Voss." Elias's voice was different now, smaller. "She disappeared 4 months ago. My father told everyone she went to a treatment center in Colorado for depression. He said she needed space. He told the school. He told the neighbors. He told her sister in Portland." The boy swallowed. "She doesn't have depression. She found something. On his computer. I don't know what. They fought. I heard it through the floor. The next morning she was gone, and my father sat me down at the kitchen table and told me my mother was sick and needed help, and that I should be brave and not talk about it." The coffee in Ronan's mug had gone cold. He hadn't touched it since Elias started talking. "You tried telling someone," Ronan said. Not a question. Elias nodded. "My teacher first, Mrs. Calloway. She said she'd look into it. 2 days later, she told me my father had called the school and explained everything and that I should focus on my studies. Then I went to Coach Britton. He said the same thing. Then I called the police non-emergency line. They transferred me 3 times. The last person I talked to said they'd send someone. Nobody came." "How long ago was that?" 6 weeks. "And you came here." Elias looked up. His eyes were dry, but there was something behind them that Ronan recognized with a physical jolt. Not sadness, not anger, but the cold, clear understanding that every system designed to protect him had already decided he wasn't worth protecting. Ronan had seen that look before. In the mirror. In the faces of men who'd come home from wars to find that the country they'd fought for had no interest in fighting for them. "I heard things about this club," Elias said quietly. "At school, kids talk. They say you're dangerous." "We are," Ronan said. "They say you help people nobody else helps." Ronan didn't answer that. He closed the notebook and set it on the table between them with the kind of deliberate care usually reserved for loaded weapons. "Dex," he said, without turning around. Dex was already moving, laptop under his arm, pulling a chair up to the table. "I heard everything. Give me 2 hours." The clubhouse settled into a different kind of silence. Not the empty quiet of a slow morning, but the focused hush of men who had just been given a mission and were already calculating the cost. Ronan walked Elias to the back room, a small space with a cot, a wool blanket, and a space heater that actually worked. "You're going to stay here for a while," he said. "Is there anyone who knows where you are?" "No." "Does your father know you're gone?" Elias shook his head. "He leaves for the office at 6. I left at 6:15. He won't check on me until tonight. Maybe not even then." That sentence sat in Ronan's chest like a broken rib. He nodded, pulled the door mostly closed, and walked back to the main room. Tommy was already standing, arms crossed, his unlit cigarette tucked behind his ear. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which was more words than Tommy usually used in an entire day. "I'm thinking that kid just handed us a live grenade," Ronan said. "And I'm thinking about what happens if we set it down." "We don't set it down," Tommy said. Ronan looked at him. Tommy looked back. The conversation was over. 2 hours became 3. Dex worked with the kind of manic precision that meant he'd found something and was pulling threads. The laptop screen reflected off his glasses, numbers and documents, and satellite images cascading across his face in pale blue light. Ronan sat across from him, drinking fresh coffee that was only marginally better than the first pot, watching Dex's expression shift from curiosity to concentration to something darker. "Ronan." Dex turned the laptop around. On the screen was a corporate filing, a shell company called Ridgeline Solutions LLC, registered in Delaware with a mailing address that traced back to a P.O. box in Nevada. The sole managing member was listed as Gerald V. Strand. Dex had already run the name. Gerald V. Strand didn't exist. The Social Security number attached to the filing belonged to a deceased man in Tucson. But the bank accounts connected to Ridgeline Solutions showed deposits that matched, almost to the dollar, almost to the day, the disbursement schedule of the Ridgecrest Community Trust. "How much?" Ronan asked. "What I can see? Just from the accounts I can access without getting us both arrested?" Dex pushed his glasses up. $3.7 million in the last 18 months. And that's just one shell. There are at least 4 others I can see the edges of. This thing goes deeper than a charity scam, Ronan. This is infrastructure. This is built. Ronan stared at the screen. $3.7 million. Funneled through a charity that the entire county believed in, managed by a man the entire county trusted, built on the backs of people who were supposed to be receiving food and blankets and medical supplies, and instead were receiving nothing. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a woman had found the truth and vanished. "The mountain property," Ronan said. "The kid mentioned his father has a retreat, something private, somewhere north." Dex was already typing. "Give me an hour." Mara Quinn arrived at the clubhouse just after noon, the way she always arrived. Without announcement, without noise, the front door opening and closing so quietly that you'd miss it if you weren't watching. She was 41, with short dark hair and hands that moved with the economy of someone who'd spent 15 years as a trauma nurse in an ER that saw more gunshot wounds than car accidents. She wasn't a patched member. The Iron Ledger didn't patch women, a policy that Ronan privately considered outdated but hadn't yet had the political capital to change. But Mara had been part of the club's operations for 6 years, and nobody questioned her presence or her judgment. She carried a canvas bag that contained, among other things, a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, 2 granola bars, and a burner phone. She set the bag on the table and looked at Ronan. "I got your call," she said. "Where's the kid?" "Back room. Sleeping, maybe." Mara went to check. She came back 2 minutes later. "He's not sleeping. He's lying on that cot staring at the ceiling with his jacket still zipped up. That boy hasn't felt safe enough to close his eyes in weeks." She sat down across from Ronan. "Talk to me." Ronan told her everything: the notebook, the trucks, the shell companies, the missing mother, the systems that had failed, the teacher, the coach, the police. Every door that had been opened just wide enough for a child to see the light before it was slammed shut in his face. Mara listened the way she always listened, completely still, her eyes fixed on Ronan's face, absorbing not just the words, but the spaces between them, the things he wasn't saying, the weight behind his pauses. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The mother," Mara said. "Lena." Dex is looking. "If she's being held, and I'm saying if, then we're not talking about a charity fraud anymore. We're talking about a man who imprisons the people who threaten his operation." "I know. And that boy walked in here and put a target on his own back to try to save her." Ronan didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both understood the math. "The property exists," Dex said from across the room, and both Ronan and Mara turned. Dex had pulled up a satellite image. A remote structure nestled in a mountain valley about 40 miles north, surrounded by dense pine forest, accessed by a single unpaved road. The property was registered to another shell company, this one called Stillwater Holdings. County records showed it as an unoccupied hunting lodge, but the satellite images told a different story. Recent tire tracks, a generator visible near the tree line, vehicles parked behind the structure, and what appeared to be a security camera mounted on a post near the entrance to the access road. "That's not a hunting lodge," Mara said quietly. "No," Dex agreed. "It's not." Ronan stood. The chair scraped against the concrete floor, a sharp sound that cut through the hum of the space heaters. He walked to the window and looked out at the row of Harleys, chrome dull under the overcast sky, exhaust pipes cold, waiting. Tommy appeared beside him. "How many?" "For this? Tight. 6 riders, quiet approach, no patches visible. In and out." "When?" Ronan looked at the sky. The gray was deepening, and the weather report on Dex's laptop showed a cold front moving in from the northwest. Snow by evening. The kind of storm that erased tracks and deadened sound and made everything, roads, forest, mountain passes, dangerous and empty. Tonight, Ronan said. Behind them, the back room door opened and Elias stood in the doorway, the crimson notebook once again pressed against his chest. He looked at Ronan. Ronan looked back. Neither of them spoke, but the understanding that passed between them was older than language. The understanding between someone who needs protection and someone who has already decided to provide it, regardless of the cost. Mara moved first. She crossed the room, knelt in front of Elias, and looked up into his face. "Hey," she said softly. "We're going to find your mom." "I know," Elias said. And the way he said it, not with hope, not with relief, but with the flat certainty of a child who had already calculated that these were the only people left who might actually try, broke something in every person in that room. Dex began packing gear. Tommy retrieved a duffel bag from the storage closet. Kessler checked the oil pressure on 6 bikes and said nothing. Ronan pulled on his leather jacket, the weight of it settling across his shoulders like armor that offered no protection against bullets, but served a different purpose: identity, commitment, the physical reminder that the man wearing it had chosen a side. The afternoon bled into early evening, and the sky went from gray to the color of old iron. Snow began falling just after 5. Light at first, then thicker, the flakes catching the security light above the clubhouse door and dissolving against the warm metal of the exhaust headers as the Harleys rumbled to life one by one. 6 bikes, 6 riders, Ronan at the front, Tommy on his right, Mara riding her own machine. A stripped-down Sportster she'd rebuilt herself. No chrome, no polish, just function. Dex rode with a waterproof case strapped across his back containing 2 laptops and a signal interceptor. 2 other patched members, silent men with road names that didn't matter yet, filled out the formation. Elias watched from the clubhouse window, his breath fogging the glass, the notebook in his hands. Ronan had told him to stay. The boy had obeyed, but the look on his face said he understood something that most adults never learned, that waiting is its own form of courage, and sometimes the hardest thing you can do is trust someone else to fight for you. The engines roared into the falling snow. Headlights carved tunnels through the white, and the formation moved north on Route 9. The same road Elias had stood above on that overpass, counting trucks, counting lies, building the architecture of a truth that nobody wanted to hear. The road emptied as they climbed. Ridgecrest fell behind and below, its lights dimming to a faint orange glow in the rearview mirrors. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. Wind cut across the highway from the west, pushing snow sideways, stinging exposed skin, turning every mile into a negotiation between machine and weather. Ronan's hands were numb inside his gloves. His knees ached from the cold, and the scar on his face throbbed the way it always did in winter, a personal barometer he'd never asked for. They turned off the highway onto the county road. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to frozen dirt, then to a narrow track through pine forest so dense that the headlights created more shadow than light. Branches scraped against handlebars. The engines dropped to a low rumble, then lower still, and finally Ronan raised his fist and the formation stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that exists only in deep forest in winter, where the snow absorbs every sound and the darkness is so complete that the world feels like it's been erased and redrawn, with only the things right in front of you. Dex dismounted and opened his case. The laptop screen threw pale light across his face as he tapped into the property's security frequency. 2 cameras, one at the access road entrance, one at the northwest corner of the structure. Wireless feed. I can loop them, but I need physical proximity, within 200 yards. How long to get in? Ronan asked. The cameras? 4 minutes once I'm in range. The generator. If I can reach the fuel line, I can cut power to the whole property. But that also kills whatever heating system they're running, and if someone's inside... We can't assume the building is empty, Mara said. Her voice was low, controlled, but Ronan could hear the edge underneath it. The nurse's instinct, the part of her that calculated outcomes in terms of survival percentages and triage protocols. If Lena is in there, she might be injured. She might be sedated. She might not be able to move on her own. Then we go quiet, Ronan said. Dex loops the cameras. We kill the generator. Tommy and Kessler take the perimeter. Mara, you're with me inside. Nobody argued, nobody asked questions. The plan settled over them like the snow, quietly, inevitably, covering everything. They moved on foot from there, leaving the bikes behind a stand of pines, engines ticking as they cooled. The forest floor was frozen solid, every step producing a small crack that sounded enormous in the silence. Ronan led. Mara walked behind him. Their breath came in short white plumes that dissolved into the dark. Through the trees, the compound materialized, a large wooden structure, lodge-style, 2 stories, windows dark except for a faint amber glow from somewhere deep inside. The generator hummed near the eastern wall, its exhaust creating a thin column of vapor that rose and vanished against the black sky. One vehicle was parked near the front entrance, a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates that had been swapped for civilian tags. Dex had spotted the swap in the satellite images. The original plates traced to a rental company that did business exclusively with Grant Voss's shell companies. Ronan crouched behind a fallen tree and studied the building. His training, 2 tours, 13 years of riding, 6 years of running the Iron Ledger, collapsed into a single point of focus. Entry points, sight lines, cover, exit routes, the geometry of risk. The amber light flickered inside. Someone was in there. And 40 miles south, in a clubhouse that smelled like burnt coffee and old promises, a 13-year-old boy sat alone in the dark, holding a crimson notebook full of truths that had already set something in motion that none of them, not Ronan, not Mara, not Elias, and certainly not Grant Voss, could stop. But what none of them knew yet, what Dex's signal interceptor was just beginning to pick up as the snow thickened and the wind shifted and the temperature dropped below freezing, was that Grant Voss wasn't in Ridgecrest tonight. His phone signal was pinging from a tower less than 6 miles from where they were standing, and it was moving closer. Dex's hand shot up in the darkness. 2 fingers, then a fist, then a flat palm pressed toward the ground. The universal signal for, "Get down, stay quiet, something is wrong." Ronan dropped to one knee behind the fallen tree, the frozen bark biting through his jeans. Mara crouched beside him, her breath coming in thin white streams, one hand already reaching into her bag for the flashlight she kept rubber-banded to a tactical knife. Through the trees, the amber glow inside the lodge pulsed once, then steadied. The generator hummed its low mechanical heartbeat. And somewhere to the south, back down the mountain, back along the road they'd just ridden, headlights swept through the pine canopy like searchlights. "That's not our bikes," Tommy said from somewhere to Ronan's left, his voice barely above a breath. "No," Dex confirmed, eyes locked on his laptop screen, the blue light carving hollows in his face. "The phone signal I picked up. It stopped moving. He's parked, 1/2 mile south, just sitting there." "How many?" "1 phone. But that doesn't mean 1 vehicle. If he's smart, he's smart," Ronan said. "That's the whole problem." The forest held its breath. Snow fell through the canopy in slow spirals, catching the faint glow from Dex's screen and vanishing. Ronan's mind was running calculations the way it had in Helmand, routes, contingencies, the brutal arithmetic of exposure versus opportunity. Grant Voss was 1/2 mile away. His wife was somewhere inside that lodge, and the window between those 2 facts was closing with every second. "We go now," Ronan said. "Dex, loop the cameras. Tommy, Kessler, south perimeter. If anything comes up that road, I want to know before they see the building." "And if it's him?" Tommy asked. Ronan looked at the old man. In the darkness, Tommy's face was all angles and shadow. The deep lines around his mouth set into something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite resolve, but lived in the territory between them. "Then you buy us time." Tommy nodded once and disappeared into the trees with Kessler. No sound, no hesitation, just 2 shapes absorbed by the darkness, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Dex moved first, cutting a diagonal path through the pines toward the northwest corner of the lodge, his footsteps impossibly quiet for a man carrying 40 pounds of equipment. Ronan watched the blue dot of his laptop screen weave through the trees like a firefly until it stopped, held steady, and then blinked twice. The signal. Cameras looped. Ronan touched Mara's shoulder. She looked at him and gave a single nod that contained everything: readiness, fear, acceptance, the particular kind of courage that comes not from the absence of terror, but from the refusal to let it make your decisions. They moved. The distance from the tree line to the lodge was 40 yards of open ground. Frozen grass crunched underfoot despite every effort at silence. The generator noise covered some of it, the steady diesel chug masking the smaller sounds of their approach. But Ronan felt exposed in a way that made the muscles between his shoulder blades contract involuntarily. Open ground in hostile territory. Same feeling. Different war. They reached the east wall. Ronan pressed his back against the wooden siding, feeling the vibration of the generator through his jacket. The wood was rough, weather-beaten, the kind of surface that caught on leather and left splinters in skin. He moved along the wall toward the back of the structure, where a door, service entrance, utility access, something not designed for guests, sat recessed in a shallow alcove, locked. But the lock was old. A pin tumbler, probably original to the building, the kind of hardware that trusted geography more than security. Ronan pulled a tension wrench and a pick from the kit in his vest pocket, tools he carried the way other men carried wallets, out of habit and necessity, and had the door open in under 90 seconds. The air inside was different, warmer but not comfortable, stale, closed in, the smell of dust and old carpet and something chemical underneath. Cleaning solution maybe, or something designed to mask a different smell. Mara noticed it too. Her nostrils flared and she mouthed a word at Ronan that he couldn't read in the dark but understood from context: medication. They were in a narrow hallway, bare bulbs overhead turned off, doors on both sides, utility closets, storage, the mechanical guts of the building. The amber light was coming from somewhere deeper inside, toward the front, seeping under a door at the far end of the hall like a stain spreading across the floor. Ronan moved in silence. Each step was deliberate: heel, roll, toe, the way he'd been trained, the way his body remembered even when his conscious mind was occupied with the 1,000 variables spinning through it. Behind him, Mara moved with the same economy, her trauma bag slung across her body, one hand free, the other resting on the strap. The door at the end of the hall was not locked. Ronan turned the handle and pushed it open inch by inch until the gap was wide enough to see through. A room, large, open. The main living space of the lodge. Stone fireplace against the far wall, cold and dark, ashes gray in the hearth. Furniture covered with white sheets like ghosts frozen mid-conversation. And in the center of the room, sitting in a straight-backed wooden chair beneath a single standing lamp, the source of that amber glow, was a woman. Lena Voss. She was thinner than the photographs Dex had pulled from the internet. Much thinner. Her hair, which had been auburn in the pictures, was darker now, unwashed, pulled back with a rubber band. She wore a gray sweatshirt and sweatpants, both too large, and her feet were bare on the stone floor. Her wrists showed the faded marks of restraints, not current, but recent enough that the skin was still discolored. She sat with her hands in her lap, her eyes open, staring at the far wall with the unfocused gaze of someone who had been left alone long enough to stop expecting rescue. Mara made a sound. Not a word. Something smaller, something involuntary. The sound a nurse makes when she sees damage she's trained to treat, but never trained to accept. Ronan put his hand on her arm. Wait. He scanned the room. No guards visible. No cameras that he could see, though the absence of visible security didn't mean the absence of surveillance. The lodge felt empty. That particular quality of stillness that inhabits a space where only one person has been breathing. Ronan pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked. Lena's head turned, and for a moment her eyes were blank, registering the intrusion without processing it, the way a person reacts when they've been conditioned to expect nothing good from an opening door. Then she focused. On Ronan's leather jacket, on the patches, on the hard, scarred face of a stranger who had no business being in this room at this hour, in this storm. Don't, her voice cracked, dry, unused. Don't hurt me. Nobody's hurting you, Mara said, stepping past Ronan, crossing the room with that calm, purposeful stride that belonged to emergency departments and triage tents, and every space where panic was a luxury nobody could afford. She knelt in front of Lena and looked into her face the way she'd looked at Elias, directly, honestly, without pity, with the kind of unflinching attention that said, I see you and what I see matters. My name is Mara. I'm a nurse. Your son sent us. Lena's expression shattered. Not dramatically, no sobbing, no collapse, nothing cinematic. Just a fracture that ran through her face the way a crack runs through ice, starting at the eyes and spreading outward until her whole expression was something broken and raw and real. Elias, she whispered. He's safe. He's at our clubhouse. He walked in this morning with a notebook and told us everything. Lena's hand went to her mouth. Her fingers were trembling. I told him to run. 3 months ago. I wrote him a note, hid it in his backpack. I told him to take the notebook and go to someone. Anyone. She closed her eyes. I didn't think he'd actually... He did, Ronan said from the doorway. He's braver than most men I've served with. And I don't say that lightly. Lena looked at him. Through the fractures in her composure, something else was emerging. Not gratitude, not relief, but anger. The cold, specific, weaponized anger of a woman who had been caged by someone she once loved and had spent every day of that captivity converting her fear into fury. He's coming, Lena said. The words hit the room like a percussion grenade. Grant. He comes every 3 days, sometimes 4. He brings food, medication, things to keep me calm, compliant. He sits in that chair. She pointed to a second chair near the fireplace. And he talks to me like nothing is wrong, like I'm a guest, like I chose to be here. Her voice hardened. I didn't choose this. We know, Mara said. We're getting you out. You don't understand. Lena grabbed Mara's wrist with a strength that surprised everyone in the room. He has security. 2 men. They rotate. One stays at the gate and one stays in the guest house behind the main lodge. They're not here right now because Grant pulled them off when the storm hit. He doesn't think I can go anywhere in this weather, but they'll be back by morning. Ronan's jaw tightened. The guest house. How far? 200 yards? Maybe less. There's a path through the trees. Is it occupied right now? I don't know. I haven't heard anyone in hours, but I can't see outside. The windows are sealed. Ronan keyed the 2-way radio clipped to his vest. Dex. Static. Then Dex's voice, low and tight. I see it. Small structure northwest of the main building. Dark. No movement. No thermal signature, but my equipment isn't built for this cold. I could be missing something. Understood. Ronan looked at Mara. Get her ready to move. I want to be back at the bikes in 10 minutes. Mara was already assessing Lena, checking her pulse, looking at her pupils, running her hands gently over the woman's wrists and ankles with the practiced efficiency of someone who had cataloged injuries in the dark before. She's dehydrated, possible malnutrition, some bruising on her forearms, older. She can walk, but she can't run. She won't have to run, Ronan said. We'll carry her if we need to. He moved to the window. The sealed glass was covered with a heavy curtain, and behind the curtain a sheet of plywood had been screwed into the frame from the outside. Not just privacy. Containment. This woman hadn't seen the sky in months. Ronan's radio crackled. Tommy's voice barely a whisper. Movement on the road, half-mile, headlights off, but I can hear the engine. It's coming slow. Every calculation in Ronan's head shifted. The window had just closed by half. How long? Ronan asked. 4 minutes. Maybe 5. The road's iced over. That's slowing him down. Ronan turned to Mara. Now. Mara helped Lena to her feet. The woman swayed, steadied herself against the chair, then straightened with a determination that came from somewhere deeper than muscle or bone. Mara draped her own jacket over Lena's shoulders and guided her toward the hallway. They moved faster going out. The stealth that had governed their entry was replaced by the urgent efficiency of extraction, every step trading caution for speed. Down the hallway, through the service door, into the cold, where the snow had thickened into a curtain of white that reduced visibility to 20 feet and turned the forest into an abstraction, dark shapes without edges, distances without measurement. Lena gasped when the cold hit her. 4 months inside a sealed room, and now this. Freezing air cutting into lungs that had been breathing the same recycled atmosphere since summer. Mara held her upright, one arm around her waist, moving through the snow with the grim determination of someone who has carried worse in worse conditions. They reached the tree line. Dex materialized beside them, laptop closed, pack on his back, his face tight with something Ronan hadn't seen before. Fear. Not of the situation, of what the situation meant. "Ronan," Dex said, "there's something else." "Not now." "It has to be now." Dex grabbed Ronan's arm, a breach of protocol that stopped Ronan cold. In 6 years, Dex had never touched him uninvited. "While you were inside, I intercepted a call from the phone signal, from Grant. He wasn't calling the lodge. He was calling the county sheriff." The words hung in the frozen air between them. "He reported a break-in at his property. He identified the Iron Ledger by name. He said," Dex's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man delivering intelligence he wished he hadn't collected. "He said an outlaw motorcycle gang was attempting to kidnap his wife from a private medical facility." The ground shifted beneath Ronan's feet. Not literally. The frozen earth was solid, unyielding, indifferent, but strategically, everything had just inverted. They weren't rescuers anymore. In the eyes of the law, they were kidnappers. Grant Voss had anticipated this, had planned for it, had positioned himself not as the villain, but as the victim, calling in the cavalry before Ronan could get Lena off the mountain. "He set a trap," Mara said, and the quiet fury in her voice could have melted the snow around her feet. "Not a trap," Ronan said slowly, his mind working through the geometry. "A frame. He wanted us here. He wanted us to take Lena. Because the moment we did, we became criminals, and he became the concerned husband." Lena, leaning against Mara, her face white from cold and exhaustion, and something far worse, shook her head. "He does this. He does this with everything. He turns the truth inside out. He makes the rescuers look like the threat, and the threat look like the rescuer." Her voice was raw. "That's how he kept me silent. Every time I tried to tell someone, he'd already told them first. A different story. A better story. With tears and everything." Ronan looked back through the trees toward the lodge. The headlights Tommy had reported were still invisible. The curve of the road and the density of the forest kept them hidden. But the sound of an engine was faintly audible now, a low mechanical hum threading through the silence of the storm. "How long before the sheriff responds?" Ronan asked Dex. "Depends on whether there's a unit near the mountain. Could be 20 minutes, could be 40. In this storm, the road's up here. Assume 20. Dex nodded. Ronan made a decision. It took less than 2 seconds, and it would cost him more than he could calculate. He keyed the radio. "Tommy, fall back to the bikes. We're moving." But the vehicle on the road. "Let it come. We won't be here." They moved through the forest in a loose column, Ronan on point, Mara and Lena in the middle, Dex covering the rear. Kessler appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, fell into step beside Dex without a word. The snow was coming harder now, thick wet flakes that stuck to everything and reduced the world to a 10-foot radius of visibility. Ronan's boots broke through a thin crust of ice with every step, the sound swallowed by the storm before it could travel. Lena was struggling. Her bare feet, they hadn't been able to find shoes in the lodge, and the time to search had evaporated, were leaving red marks in the snow behind her. Mara noticed, said nothing, and shifted her grip so she was bearing more of the woman's weight. Ronan saw it too and dropped back. "Can you ride?" he asked Lena. "I haven't been on a motorcycle in..." "You won't be driving, you'll ride behind Mara. Hold on and don't let go." "Can you do that?" Lena looked at him. In the darkness and the snow and the impossible pressure of the moment, she did something that Ronan would remember for a very long time. She smiled. Small, fierce, and nothing close to happy. The smile of a woman who had been told for 4 months that she was powerless and was about to prove someone wrong. "I can do that." They reached the bikes. Tommy was already there, engine idling, the low rumble of his Harley creating a pocket of familiar sound in the alien wilderness. The other bikes sat cold and silent, snow accumulating on seats and handlebars. Kessler brushed the snow off and began prep while the others mounted. Ronan swung his leg over the seat and hit the starter. The engine caught on the second try, the exhaust note punching through the quiet like a declaration. One by one, the other bikes roared to life. Tommy, Dex, the 2 silent members, and finally Mara, with Lena climbing onto the seat behind her, wrapping her arms around the nurse's waist, pressing her face against the back of Mara's jacket. "South," Ronan said. "Fast. We take the county road to the highway, then east. Not back through Ridgecrest. There's a safe house in Carver Falls. We go there, we regroup, we figure out our next move before this whole thing comes down on our heads." The formation moved. 6 bikes cutting through a snowstorm on a mountain road in the dark, headlights carving cones of white through the falling snow, engines roaring loud enough to shake the trees. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was the only option left. They hit the county road and accelerated. The surface was treacherous, frozen dirt under fresh snow, invisible patches of black ice that sent the rear tires sideways and required constant correction. Ronan leaned into the curves with the instinct of a man who had logged 100,000 miles on roads that wanted to kill him, his hands steady on the bars despite the cold that had turned his fingers into something barely functional. Behind him, the column held formation, tight, disciplined. The gap between bikes never more than a car length, every rider watching the taillights ahead with the concentration of men who understood that survival was a collective act. They were 3 miles from the highway when Dex's voice crackled over the radio. "Ronan, pull over." Something in his tone. Ronan slowed, pulled to the shoulder, such as it was, a narrow strip of frozen gravel before the tree line, and killed his engine. The others followed. In the sudden silence, the wind screamed through the pine canopy above them, and the snow seemed to fall faster, as if the absence of engine noise had given it permission. Dex dismounted and walked to Ronan, his laptop open under his jacket to keep the screen dry. "I kept a passive intercept running on Grant's phone. He made another call, 3 minutes ago." "To who?" Dex turned the screen so Ronan could see. A phone number. And beneath it, the name Dex had matched through a reverse lookup. Ronan read it. Then he read it again. The cold inside him had nothing to do with the weather. The number belonged to a sergeant in the county sheriff's department, not the dispatch line, a personal cell. And the call had lasted 11 seconds, long enough for a single instruction, a confirmation, a piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself long before Elias walked through the clubhouse door. "He owns a cop," Ronan said. "At least one," Dex said. "Probably more. The call pattern I'm seeing, there are regular contacts with 3 other numbers in law enforcement, weekly, for months." Mara walked over, Lena still clinging to her arm. "What does that mean for us?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. He stood in the snow, the cold burning the exposed skin of his face, his leather jacket dusted white, and he ran the numbers one more time. They had a rescued woman who would be labeled a kidnapping victim. They had a notebook full of evidence compiled by a 13-year-old that any decent attorney could challenge. They had intercepted communications obtained without a warrant, which meant they were inadmissible in any court. And the man they were up against had law enforcement in his pocket, a public reputation built on decades of manufactured goodness, and the resources to fight this war on every front simultaneously. The math didn't work. It hadn't worked since the moment Dex intercepted that first call. Maybe it had never worked. Maybe Grant Voss had built a machine so efficient that the gears would grind anyone who tried to stop it, and the only question was whether the grinding would be slow or fast. But 40 miles south, a boy was sitting alone in a clubhouse, holding a crimson notebook, waiting for people he barely knew to bring his mother home. And that boy had walked through a door he could never walk back through, and so had they. "Ronan," Tommy's voice. Quiet, steady. The voice of a man who had buried his family and kept breathing. "Whatever you're calculating, stop. We're past math." Ronan looked at him. "We took the woman. We committed. Every mile from here is deeper in. There's no version of tonight where we ride home and pretend this didn't happen." Tommy's cigarette was unlit, tucked into the corner of his mouth, a prop for a habit that had outlived the habit itself. "So the question isn't whether the math works. The question is what kind of men we are when it doesn't." The wind shifted, the snow swirled, and somewhere behind them, back up that mountain road, the headlights that Tommy had spotted earlier were now visible, distant, small, but unmistakably moving in their direction. Ronan mounted his bike. "Carver Falls," he said. "No stops." The engines thundered back to life. The formation surged forward into the storm, away from the mountain, away from the lodge, away from everything that was supposed to be safe and toward everything that wasn't. Behind them, the headlights followed. In front of them, the road disappeared into a darkness that offered no promises and demanded everything. And in Ronan's chest, beneath the leather and the patches and the scar tissue of a life spent on the wrong side of every line society drew, a single thought pulsed like a second heartbeat. Grant Voss had called this moment before it happened, had positioned every piece, had turned rescue into crime and truth into liability, but he hadn't accounted for the notebook. He hadn't accounted for a 13-year-old boy who had spent months becoming invisible in order to see everything. And he hadn't accounted for what happens when a brotherhood of broken men decides that a child's courage is worth more than their own survival. The highway appeared through the snow like a black river cutting through white land. Ronan leaned into the on-ramp, felt the tires catch asphalt, felt the bike surge forward with the controlled violence of a machine built to eat distance. The formation followed. East, into the storm, toward a safe house that might not be safe for long. And behind them, close now, closer than before, close enough that Ronan could see twin points of light in his mirror whenever the road straightened. The headlights kept coming. The headlights stayed with them for 11 miles. Ronan counted every one. 11 miles of frozen highway, 6 bikes in tight formation, cutting through a snowstorm that had turned the world into a white tunnel of noise and wind, and those twin points of light in his mirror never gained, never fell back, just held their distance like a predator that didn't need to chase because it already knew where the prey was going. At mile 12, the lights disappeared. That was worse. Ronan didn't slow down. The highway stretched east through flat agricultural land, empty fields buried under snow, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with a single porch light burning against the dark. No traffic, no other headlights. Just the 6 Harleys and the storm and the woman on the back of Mara's bike who hadn't loosened her grip since they'd left the mountain. Carver Falls materialized at 11:47 p.m., a town that had stopped pretending to be alive sometime around the last factory closing. Its main street, a row of dark storefronts, and a single gas station with a flickering canopy light that buzzed like a dying insect. The safe house sat 2 blocks off the main road, a converted auto garage that the Iron Ledger had maintained for 7 years as a waypoint, a place to stash bikes during runs, to wait out warrants, to let men sleep who couldn't sleep anywhere else. The rolling door was rusted but functional, and Ronan had a key to the side entrance, and within 4 minutes all 6 bikes were inside, engines ticking as they cooled, exhaust fumes mingling with the smell of old grease and cold concrete. The space was exactly as Ronan remembered. A central bay large enough for the bikes, a back office with a cot and a space heater, a bathroom with running water that came out rust-colored for the first 30 seconds, fluorescent lights overhead, half of them dead, the survivors casting a yellow-green pall over everything that made skin look sick and shadows look permanent. A workbench along one wall held tools, a first aid kit, 3 cans of motor oil, and a CB radio that may or may not have worked. Mara guided Lena to the back office. The woman moved like she was walking through water, every step requiring conscious effort, her body spending energy it didn't have. Mara settled her on the cot, wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders, and began a more thorough assessment under the light of a headlamp she'd pulled from her bag. Blood pressure, pulse, pupils, skin turgor. The systematic evaluation of a woman who had been imprisoned for 4 months by a man the world called a saint. In the main bay, the bikers stood in a loose circle around nothing. Nobody sat down. The tension that had compressed inside 6 bodies during 11 miles of pursuit and the sudden absence of it had nowhere to go, and it filled the garage like pressure in a sealed container. Tommy lit a cigarette. The first drag produced a cloud of smoke that drifted toward the fluorescent lights and hung there, blue-gray, turning slowly. He exhaled through his nose and looked at Ronan the way a man looks at a map when every road on it leads somewhere he doesn't want to go. "He let us take her," Tommy said. Ronan said nothing. He was standing with his back against the workbench, arms crossed, staring at a point on the concrete floor between his boots. His leather jacket was wet with snowmelt and clung to his shoulders like a second skin. The scar on his face was white in the fluorescent light, whiter than usual, the surrounding skin flushed red from cold and adrenaline, making the old wound look fresh. "Ronan." Tommy's voice carried no demand, no impatience, just the steady insistence of a man who had learned the hard way that silence, past a certain point, becomes its own kind of failure. He let us take her. That phone call to the sheriff happened before we got inside the lodge. He knew we were coming, and he let us walk in. Why? Because she's not the prize, Dex said from the corner, where he'd set up his laptop on an upturned crate and was running through data with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the mountain. She was never the prize. Everyone looked at him. Dex's face in the laptop glow was the color of something left in the rain, gray, washed out, the glasses reflecting code and numbers that scrolled too fast to read. He took them off and pressed his palms against his eyes, hard, like he was trying to push something back inside his skull. "Talk," Ronan said. Dex put his glasses back on. He turned the laptop so the screen faced the room. While we were riding, I set up an automated intercept on Grant's known phone numbers. He made 4 calls after the one to the sheriff. The first was to a law firm in the state capital, Whitfield, Bryce, and Keller. They specialize in custody disputes and civil commitment cases. The second was to a Dr. Raymond Pace at a facility called Clearview Behavioral Health. I looked it up. It's a private psychiatric institution. Involuntary holds, court-ordered evaluations. The silence in the garage changed texture, became something thicker, harder to breathe. The third call was to a number I couldn't trace, burner, probably, and lasted less than 8 seconds. But the fourth call, Dex paused. His jaw worked. The fourth call was to a woman named Sheila Adler. She's a case supervisor with the County Department of Child and Family Services. Kessler, the prospect, spoke for the first time in hours. What does that mean? Ronan knew what it meant. He could feel the shape of it forming in his mind the way you feel weather change. Not seeing it yet, but knowing it's coming, knowing it's going to be bad. It means Grant isn't trying to get his wife back, Ronan said slowly. He's trying to get his son. The words detonated in the room without sound. Every man processed them at a different speed, but they all arrived at the same conclusion. Grant Voss had let them rescue Lena because Lena wasn't the threat. The notebook was the threat, and the notebook was with Elias. The call to the lawyer, Dex continued, his voice operating on the clinical frequency he used when the data was worse than the mission. I intercepted a partial text exchange after the call. Grant is filing for emergency custody. He's going to argue that Lena is mentally unstable. That's what the psychiatric facility is for, to provide documentation. And that Elias has been removed from a safe environment by criminal elements. The child services call was to initiate an emergency welfare check. On the clubhouse, Tommy said. On the clubhouse. Ronan pushed off the workbench. He walked 3 steps, stopped, turned, walked back. The restless movement of a man whose body needed to act while his mind was still constructing the geometry of disaster. When? The custody filing can happen first thing in the morning. Emergency orders move fast when you have the right lawyer and a cooperative judge. The welfare check, Dex checked his screen, could be as early as dawn. They'll show up with sheriff's deputies. If Elias is there, they take him. If the notebook is there, it becomes evidence. But evidence in their custody, processed through a system Grant has already compromised. Who's at the clubhouse right now? Ronan asked. Briggs left 2 prospects to watch the kid. Vasquez and that new one, Murray. Call them. Dex dialed. The phone rang 4 times, 5, 6, then a click. Vasquez's voice, thick with sleep. Yeah. Put the kid on. Shuffling, a door, then Elias's voice, clearer than it had any right to be at midnight. Is she okay? Ronan closed his eyes. The question, not where is she, not what happened, but is she okay, told him everything about the kind of child this was. The kind who'd been carrying other people's safety on his shoulders so long that his own barely registered. She's with us. She's safe. Elias, listen to me. I need you to do something, and I need you to do it right now. Take the notebook. Take anything you brought. Vasquez is going to drive you somewhere. Do exactly what he says. Can you do that? Where am I going? I'll tell Vasquez. You just go. A pause. The sound of a boy processing information the way he'd been processing it for months, quickly, without the luxury of childhood's buffer between knowing and understanding. He's coming for me, Elias said. Not a question. Not if we move first. The notebook has to stay safe. It will. Another pause, shorter this time. Okay. Ronan gave Vasquez the address of a second location, an apartment above a laundromat in a town called Finch, 20 miles east of Ridgecrest, rented under a name that didn't connect to the Iron Ledger. Get him there. Don't use the highway. Don't stop. Don't answer your phone unless it's me or Dex. Vasquez hung up. Ronan stared at his own phone for a moment, then put it in his pocket and looked at the room. Mara had come out of the back office and was standing in the doorway. Her expression told him she'd heard everything. Behind her, Lena was sitting up on the cot, the thermal blanket clutched around her shoulders, her eyes visible through the half-open door, wide, alert, burning with something that had nothing to do with fever. There's something else, Mara said. Ronan looked at her. Something in her voice, a quality he'd learned to recognize over 6 years. The particular flatness that Mara deployed when the information she was about to deliver was going to change the room's pressure. Lena has bruising on her upper arms and torso. Some of it's weeks old, some of it's recent. But that's not what I need to tell you. Mara stepped into the main bay and pulled the office door mostly closed behind her, giving Lena privacy but keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. She has injection marks. Both arms. Inner elbow. Recent. Whatever Grant was giving her to keep her compliant, her word, it wasn't oral medication. He was injecting her with something. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The sound was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. I asked her if she knew what it was, Mara continued. She doesn't. She said it made her sleep, sometimes for hours. Sometimes she'd lose whole days. She'd wake up and the light outside the window would be different, and she wouldn't know if it was morning or evening. Dex's typing had stopped. Tommy's cigarette was burning untouched between his fingers, a column of ash growing toward his knuckle. Kessler was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who had joined a motorcycle club for brotherhood and was discovering what that word actually costs. That's not captivity, Mara said, and her voice cracked for the first time. A hairline fracture in the professional composure she maintained the way Ronan maintained his tactical calm, through practice and necessity and the fear of what would happen if it failed. That's something else. That's someone systematically drugging a woman to prevent her from testifying about what she knows. Ronan's hands had curled into fists at his sides. He didn't notice until the pressure of his own nails against his palms broke through the layers of cold and adrenaline and rage. He unclenched them deliberately, one finger at a time, the way he'd taught himself in therapy at the VA. The therapy he'd attended 11 times before the funding was cut, and the program dissolved and the waiting list grew so long that it became its own kind of lie. What does she know? He asked. Mara glanced back at the office door. She won't say, not yet. She said she'll tell you, but only you, and only when she knows Elias is safe. She's terrified, Ronan. Not of Grant coming to get her. She's past that. She's terrified of what happens to Elias if she talks, and nobody believes her. We believe her. We're outlaws. In the eyes of every system that matters, our belief doesn't count. The truth of that statement settled over the room like the snow settling over the fields outside. Quietly, completely, covering everything. They were the Iron Ledger. They were bikers. They were men with records and patches and a clubhouse that smelled like engine oil and burnt coffee. And in the hierarchy of credibility that governed courtrooms and custody hearings and emergency welfare checks, they ranked somewhere between irrelevant and damning. Ronan walked to the rolling door. He stood in front of it, close enough to feel the cold seeping through the gaps in the metal, and he pressed his forehead against the steel. It was freezing. The sensation grounded him, pulled him back from the edge of something he couldn't afford to fall over. The white-hot fury that had been building since Elias walked through his door, that had compounded with every revelation, every intercepted call, every layer of Grant Voss's architecture of control. He breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The steel fogged and cleared with each breath. Behind him, nobody spoke. They gave him the silence the way soldiers give each other silence after contact. Not absence, but presence. The wordless agreement to occupy the same space without demand. Dex, Ronan said, his forehead still against the door. The recordings. Everything you intercepted tonight. His calls, the text fragments, the shell company data, the phone signal pinging near the lodge. Is any of it usable? Legally? No. We obtained all of it without authorization. Any court would throw it out and prosecute us for the interception. I'm not asking about court. Dex understood. If the right person saw this data, someone with subpoena power, someone who could use it as a roadmap to build their own case through legitimate channels, then yes, it's a blueprint. Everything Grant has built is in these files. The shell companies, the financial flows, the law enforcement contacts. Someone with authority could trace every thread I've found and find the same evidence through legal means. Who? Tommy asked. The sheriff is compromised. If he's got people in child services. Federal, Mara said. Everyone turned. She was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes carrying the sharp, clear focus of someone who has just seen the only path through an impossible landscape. County is dirty. State is too slow and too political. Federal jurisdiction applies because the shell companies cross state lines, Delaware, Nevada, the bank accounts. This is wire fraud, mail fraud, possibly RICO. The FBI has field offices that handle exactly this kind of financial crime. The FBI, Kessler said, and the way he said it, with the instinctive recoil of a man whose entire identity was built on the outlaw side of the law, made the word sound like a foreign language. I know, Ronan said, lifting his head from the door. He turned to face the room. His eyes moved from face to face. Tommy, Dex, Kessler, the two silent members who hadn't spoken all night but whose presence in this garage at this hour said everything about who they were and what they'd committed to. I know what that means. For all of us. Nobody spoke. The implication hung in the air like Tommy's cigarette smoke, diffusing slowly, touching everything. Going to the FBI meant exposure. It meant inviting federal agents into the Iron Ledger's orbit, into a world of unlicensed firearms and unregistered vehicles, an income that existed in no tax database. It meant opening doors that could never be closed. It meant trusting the same kind of institutional authority that had failed Lena, that had failed Elias, that had failed every person in this room at some point in their lives. The machine that chewed people up and called it process. There's another option, Tommy said. His voice was careful, measured, the words chosen the way a man chooses steps across thin ice. We have the woman. We have the kid. We have enough information to hurt Grant through our own channels. We know people. We know how to apply pressure that doesn't go through courtrooms. The silence that followed was different from the others. This one had teeth. Ronan looked at Tommy. The old man looked back, his face unreadable, the cigarette still burning between his fingers. They'd known each other for 14 years. They'd ridden together through things that didn't get talked about, and some things that did. And in all those years, Tommy had never suggested what he was suggesting now. The darker path, the one that existed on the far side of the line the Iron Ledger had always walked but never crossed. No, Ronan said. Ronan, I said no. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of something absolute. That's not what we are. That's not what that kid walked through our door looking for. He came to us because he heard we help people, not because he heard we break people. Tommy exhaled smoke and said nothing. The disagreement stayed in the air between them, not resolved, just suspended, a live wire that would need to be addressed, but not now, not tonight. The office door opened. Lena stood in the doorway, the thermal blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, her bare feet on the cold concrete, her face carrying the specific expression of a woman who has decided that silence is no longer survivable. I'll tell you what I found, she said, on Grant's computer, 4 months ago. The thing that made him lock me away. Every person in the room went still. Lena walked to the center of the bay. She moved past the bikes, past the tool bench, past the men who parted for her without being asked, and she stopped under the brightest of the surviving fluorescent tubes, standing in a pool of yellow-green light that made her look like a witness on a stage. The charity doesn't just steal money, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, operating in the same register that Elias had used that morning, the sound of someone who has rehearsed their testimony in the dark until every emotion has been extracted and only the facts remain. The warehouses where the trucks deliver. I found photographs. On a hard drive he kept locked in his desk. I broke the lock while he was at a fundraiser. The photographs showed the warehouses after delivery. There was no food, no blankets, no medical supplies. She paused. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together in front of her, pressing until the knuckles went white. There were people. The fluorescent light buzzed. Tommy's cigarette had gone out. Nobody breathed. The trucks don't deliver supplies. They deliver workers, migrant laborers, people without papers, without English, without anyone who would come looking for them. Grant's operation brings them in through the charity's logistics network, the trucks, the warehouses, the shell companies, and distributes them to agricultural operations, construction sites, industrial facilities across 3 counties. The workers are never paid. They're housed in the warehouses. They're told they owe transportation debts that will take years to repay. Lena's voice broke on the last word. She caught it, rebuilt it, continued. The photographs showed cots in rows, dozens of them, industrial lighting, padlocked doors, and the financial records on the hard drive, the real records, not the ones he shows the auditors, showed income streams that dwarfed the charity fraud, millions per year, flowing through the same shell company's decks found tonight. The room had changed. The air itself had changed. What had been a charity fraud, large, criminal, deserving of prosecution, had become something else entirely, something that altered the scale of everything they were dealing with, that transformed Grant Voss from a sophisticated thief into something exponentially more dangerous. Ronan's mind was recalculating. Every assumption, every plan, every tactical decision he'd made in the last 18 hours was built on a foundation that had just been demolished. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about a man protecting his reputation. This was about an operation, organized, systematic, industrial, that generated enough revenue and involved enough powerful people that its architect would do anything to protect it. Imprison his wife, frame an outlaw motorcycle club, buy law enforcement, drug a woman into silence, take his own son. The people in the warehouses, Mara said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away. How many? I don't know. The photographs I saw showed maybe 40. But there were files, spreadsheets, with hundreds of names. Some of them dated back years. Where are those files now? Lena closed her eyes. On the hard drive. In his office. At the house. You didn't copy them? I had 20 minutes before he came home. I photographed what I could with my phone. The next morning, my phone was gone. 2 days later, I was at the lodge. Dex was already working, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the desperate energy of someone who has just realized the scope of what they're dealing with. The warehouse locations, he said. Elias documented 7 trucks going to the old Garrett farm property. But the satellite images I pulled show 4 additional properties connected to Stillwater Holdings, all rural, all isolated, all showing the same indicators. Vehicles, generators, security. 5 locations, Ronan said. At least 5. Could be more under different shell companies I haven't found yet. Ronan looked at Lena. She looked back at him, and in the exchange, something was communicated that went beyond information. A recognition, shared and terrible, that the world they thought they were navigating was actually a different world entirely, larger and darker and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. When a 13-year-old boy opened a clubhouse door and said he'd counted 47 lies. Tommy spoke from the corner. His voice was different now. The disagreement from minutes ago was gone, replaced by something colder and more focused. The people in those warehouses. Right now, tonight. Are they still there? I don't know, Lena said. I was locked away 4 months ago. I don't know what's happened since. If they're still there, Tommy said, looking at Ronan, then every hour we spend figuring out our next move is an hour those people spend in cages. The statement landed in Ronan's chest like a bullet that didn't exit. He felt it lodge there, felt it press against everything else he was carrying. The responsibility for Elias, for Lena, for his club, for the men standing in this garage who had followed him into something that had just become infinitely bigger than any of them. We can't hit 5 locations, Ronan said. We don't have the numbers. We don't have the equipment. And if Grant has law enforcement compromised, any direct action puts those people at more risk, not less. So we go federal, Mara said. Tonight. And when the FBI asks how we know what we know, when they ask about the intercepted communications, the unauthorized entry into the lodge, the woman we extracted without legal authority? Ronan's voice was rising, not in anger, but in the desperate clarity of a man who can see every path forward and none of them are clean. We hand them a case built on crimes, our crimes, and Grant's lawyers tear it apart, while he moves the evidence and relocates the workers and rewrites the story with us as the villains. Then what? Kessler asked, and the rawness in his voice, the voice of a young man who had joined a club to find family and was finding out that family means standing in a cold garage at midnight choosing between impossible options. Cut through everything. Ronan looked at the floor, at the oil stains, at the concrete that held the memory of every machine that had ever been taken apart and rebuilt in this space. He thought about Elias, riding through the dark toward a safe house in Finch, about the notebook, 47 lies, hand-drawn maps, license plates, the meticulous architecture of a child's desperation, about Lena, standing barefoot on this cold floor, having just spoken aloud the thing that had cost her everything, and he thought about the people in the warehouses, nameless, voiceless, hidden behind the same philanthropy that had made Grant Voss the most admired man in the county. People who didn't have a crimson notebook or a motorcycle club or anyone at all standing between them and the machinery that consumed their labor and erased their existence. We need a witness, Ronan said. Not us, not Lena. Someone inside Grant's operation. Someone who knows the logistics, the locations, the financials. Someone whose testimony can't be dismissed as the word of an unstable wife or a traumatized child or a bunch of outlaw bikers. Grant's people, Dex said. The drivers, the guards, the accountants, someone in the chain. Someone who wants out, Mara added. Ronan nodded. Dex, the personnel records, the driver names Elias documented. Cross-reference them with everything you have, social media, financial records, criminal databases. Find me someone who's been inside this operation long enough to know where the bodies are buried and desperate enough to talk about it. Dex nodded and turned back to his laptop. His fingers were still shaking, but his face had settled into the focused intensity that meant the mission had a shape again, that the chaos had been compressed into a problem with parameters, and parameters were what Dex lived for. Ronan's phone buzzed. A text from Vasquez. Package delivered, location secure. Elias was safe. For now. Lena was watching Ronan. The thermal blanket had slipped off one shoulder, and the bruises on her upper arm were visible in the fluorescent light, a map of violence in shades of purple and yellow, old pain layered over older pain. She didn't cover them, she let them be seen, and the act of not hiding was itself a kind of statement. There's one more thing, she said. Ronan waited. The sergeant, the one Grant called tonight, in the sheriff's department. Lena's voice dropped, and the pain in it was no longer historical but immediate. Present, alive. His name is Dale Adkins. I know him. He came to the lodge. Twice. He sat in the living room and drank coffee with Grant while I was locked in the bedroom upstairs. They talked about routes, schedules, which deputies would be on patrol, and which roads would be clear. She took a breath. It shuddered on the way in. Dale Adkins was the responding officer the night I called 911. 6 months ago. Before the lodge. When Grant hit me for the first time and I locked myself in the bathroom and called for help. Adkins came to the house. He talked to Grant in the driveway for 10 minutes. Then he knocked on the bathroom door and told me everything was fine and I should get some rest. The fluorescent light flickered. In the strobed darkness between flickers, Ronan saw every face in the room change. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching for it, but change nonetheless. The tightening around Tommy's mouth, the way Kessler's hands curled into fists at his sides. The stillness that settled over Dex like a system shutting down to prevent overload. Mara crossed the room and put her arm around Lena's shoulders. No words, just the physical fact of one human being standing next to another and refusing to let go. Ronan pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then opened a contact he hadn't used in 3 years. A name from another life. Before the Iron Ledger, before the discharge, before the scar and the sleepless nights, and the slow construction of a world built from chrome and leather and the broken loyalty of broken men. The name was Sarah Vance. She was a federal agent. She was also the woman who had sat beside his hospital bed at Walter Reed for 11 days after Helmand and hadn't asked a single question about what happened because she already knew and knowing was enough. He hadn't spoken to her since the day he'd patched into the Iron Ledger. She'd called it a mistake. He'd called it survival. The argument had ended with a silence that lasted 3 years and was about to end with a phone call that would change everything. Ronan looked at his club, at the men and the woman who had followed him into this, at Lena standing barefoot and bruised under a fluorescent light, carrying secrets that could bring down an empire or bury them all. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "And after I make it, nothing about our lives will be the same. This club, our freedom, everything we've built, it all goes on the table." Tommy looked at him. "It's already on the table, brother. It went on the table the minute that kid walked through the door." Ronan nodded. He walked to the far corner of the garage, stood between a rusted hydraulic jack and a stack of bald tires, and dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Then a voice, sharp, guarded, carrying 3 years of silence and the particular tension of a woman who sees an old name on her screen at midnight and already knows it means trouble. "Ronan." "Sarah, I need your help." A pause, the sound of breathing, the sound of a decision being made in real time. "Tell me." And 200 miles away, in a house in Ridgecrest that smelled like leather furniture and expensive cologne, Grant Voss sat at his desk with his phone in his hand, looking at a photograph of his son, and smiled. Because the emergency custody order was already drafted, the psychiatric evaluation was already scheduled, the sheriff's sergeant was already briefed, and by morning, every piece would be in place to take back what belonged to him and erase the people who had dared to interfere. But he didn't know about Sarah Vance. He didn't know about the federal thread that was about to pull at the edge of his empire. And he didn't know that the notebook, the 47 lies, the truck routes, the warehouse maps, the license plates, was no longer in the clubhouse where his people expected to find it. It was in the hands of a 13-year-old boy who was sitting in a dark apartment above a laundromat in Finch, reading every page by the light of his phone, memorizing every word, because Elias Voss had learned something that most adults never understand. That paper can be taken, but memory is a fortress that no one can breach. Sarah Vance arrived in Carver Falls at 4:17 a.m. driving a government-issue sedan with no markings and plates registered to a fleet management company in Virginia. She parked behind the garage, killed the engine, and sat in the dark for 30 seconds before getting out. A habit from field work, letting her eyes adjust, scanning the environment, cataloging exits. The way a person who has survived certain things catalogs exits everywhere, always, even in grocery stores and restaurants and the homes of friends. She was 43, lean, sharp-featured, with close-cropped hair that had gone gray at the temples in the years since Ronan had last seen her. She wore a dark jacket over a dark sweater, no jewelry, no insignia, nothing that identified her as anything other than a woman who moved through the world with purpose and didn't waste motion on anything that wasn't necessary. She carried a laptop bag over one shoulder and a look on her face that Ronan recognized from Walter Reed, the expression of someone who has already decided to help and is now calculating the cost. Ronan met her at the side door. They stood in the narrow space between the garage wall and the sedan, breath fogging in the pre-dawn cold, and for a moment neither of them spoke. 3 years of silence has a weight, and they both felt it pressing between them like a physical thing. "You look terrible," Sarah said. "It's been a night." "I gathered." She looked at the garage door, at the faint light leaking through its seams. "How many people are in there?" "6 of mine, 1 rescued hostage, 1 situation that's bigger than anything I've ever brought you." "You never brought me anything, Ronan. You disappeared." He deserved that. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things that were true and painful, with a slight tightening around the eyes and a silence that acknowledged the blow without deflecting it. "I know." Sarah studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the decision to set the personal aside because the professional demanded it. She followed him inside. The garage looked worse in the pre-dawn hours than it had at midnight. The fluorescent lights had developed a flicker that turned every surface into a strobe, and the cold had deepened. settling into the concrete floor and radiating upward until even the bikers, hardened to weather by years of riding, were shifting their weight and tucking their hands into their jacket pockets. Tommy was on his fourth cigarette. Dex hadn't moved from his laptop in 3 hours. Kessler was asleep in a folding chair with his head tilted back at an angle that would punish him when he woke. Lena was in the back office, lying on the cot under 2 blankets, not sleeping but resting with her eyes closed. The practiced rest of a woman who had learned to conserve energy the way prisoners conserve energy in small increments, never fully letting go. Ronan introduced Sarah with no preamble. Sarah Vance, FBI, Financial Crimes. She's here as a person, not an agent. For now. Sarah scanned the room the way she'd scanned the parking area, systematically, without judgment, taking in the bikes and the oil stains and the men and the tactical reality of a safe house that was held together by rust and loyalty. "Show me what you have," she said to Dex. Dex showed her. It took 40 minutes. He walked her through the shell companies, the financial flows, the intercepted communications, the satellite imagery, the personnel cross-references he'd been building all night. He showed her Elias's notebook, photographs of each page that he'd taken before the boy left the clubhouse, and explained the truck routes and the warehouse schedules and the coded conversations. He showed her Lena's testimony, transcribed in real time while the woman spoke, every word documented. And he showed her the thing he'd found in the last hour, the thing that had changed the architecture of the case from financial fraud into something that would trigger federal jurisdiction without question. "This name," Dex said, pointing at his screen, "Marcus Weir. He appears in 3 of the shell company filings as a registered agent. I ran him through every database I could access without tripping alarms. Marcus Weir is a real person. He lives in Bridgeport. He works as a logistics coordinator for a company called Northline Transport." "And?" Sarah asked. "Northline Transport holds the contracts for 7 of the 14 trucks in Grant's charity fleet, the trucks that go to the warehouses, the trucks that Elias documented. Northline's corporate registration lists Marcus Weir as operations manager and shows annual revenue of $12 million, most of it from contracts with Grant's charity and 2 other nonprofits that I'm betting are also fronts." Dex pulled up another screen. "But here's what matters. Marcus Weir has a brother, Daniel Weir. Daniel Weir was arrested 18 months ago on unrelated charges, DUI, resisting arrest, and during the booking process, he made a statement to the arresting officer. He said, and I quote from the police report, 'You have no idea what my brother does. You have no idea what's in those trucks.' The arresting officer noted the statement in his report. Nobody followed up. The charges were pleaded down, Daniel got probation, and the file was closed." Sarah leaned forward. Her eyes had changed, no longer scanning, now focused with the intensity of a predator that has spotted movement. "Where's Daniel Weir now?" "Bridgeport. Same address as 18 months ago. He works at a tire shop on Howell Street." "And Marcus?" "That's the problem." Dex's voice tightened. "Marcus Weir hasn't been seen in 6 weeks. His apartment is empty. His phone is inactive. His bank account shows no transactions since October 15th. He's either running or he's been removed." The word removed sat in the room like smoke. Sarah straightened up. She looked at Ronan. "You understand what this is? If the trafficking component is real, and everything I'm seeing suggests it is, this is a multi-agency case. FBI, HSI, potentially DOJ. It's not something I can walk into my field office and casually open. I need predication. I need something I can point to that doesn't involve illegally intercepted communications or unauthorized entry." "Daniel Weir," Ronan said. Daniel Weir, if he'll talk, if he knows enough, if he can give me probable cause for a warrant, even a narrow one, targeting Northline Transport's financial records, then I have a legal door into this. Everything else follows." "Then we get him to talk." "We don't do anything. I approach him, alone, through proper channels. If I show up with a motorcycle club at my back, his lawyer will have the case thrown out before the first hearing." Ronan nodded. He'd expected this. The part where the professional told the outlaw to step back. The part where jurisdiction and procedure drew a line that leather and chrome couldn't cross. He'd lived his whole life on one side of that line. Sarah had lived hers on the other. And right now, in this garage, in this moment, Those two sides needed each other more than either was comfortable admitting. "There's a timing problem," Mara said from the office doorway. Everyone turned. She'd been listening, and the nurse's instinct that governed her professional life had merged with the tactical awareness she'd developed writing with the Iron Ledger, producing an insight that cut through the procedural discussion like a scalpel. "Grant is filing for emergency custody at first light. If he gets that order, and with his resources, he will, then Elias becomes the property of a court system that Grant has already compromised. You won't be able to interview the boy, you won't be able to use his testimony, and the notebook, the physical evidence, will be seized and processed through channels that a corrupt sheriff sergeant controls." Sarah absorbed this. "How long until the courts open?" Ronan checked his phone. 3 hours. "Then I have 3 hours to get to Daniel Weir, get a statement, and call in enough federal presence to freeze the custody proceeding. Can you do that?" Sarah looked at him the way she'd looked at him at Walter Reed. Honestly, without false comfort, with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who measures the distance between possible and impossible and chooses to walk it anyway. "I don't know, but I'm going to try." She left 7 minutes later, the sedan pulling out of the alley behind the garage and disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Ronan watched the taillights shrink and vanish, and the absence they left felt physical, a withdrawal of competence and authority, an institutional power that left the garage feeling smaller and colder and more exposed than before. "Now what?" Kessler asked. He'd woken up during Sarah's briefing, his neck stiff, his eyes carrying the glazed, hollowed look of a young man running on adrenaline and anxiety, and not much else. "Now we wait," Ronan said. "I don't like waiting." "Nobody does." The minutes ground forward. Dex monitored frequencies and refreshed databases. Tommy smoked and watched the door. Mara checked Lena's vitals every 30 minutes with the methodical devotion of a woman who had learned that small, consistent actions are the only reliable thing in a chaotic world. The two silent members, road names Harker and Klein, took turns standing watch at the rolling door, peering through the gap at the empty street outside, where dawn was beginning to leak into the eastern sky like a stain spreading across gray fabric. At 6:22 a.m., Ronan's phone rang. Not a call, an alert. Dex had set up a monitoring script on Grant's known phone numbers, and the alert meant activity. Ronan looked at the screen, then looked at Dex. Dex was already pulling up the data. "He's made 3 calls in the last 4 minutes, Dex said, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a countdown. 1 to the law firm, 1 to the county courthouse, the clerk's direct line, and 1 to Sergeant Adkins. The custody filing. It's happening now." Ronan dialed Sarah. The phone rang twice, 3 times, 4. "I'm with Daniel Weir," Sarah said, her voice low, clipped. Background noise, a door closing, muffled voices. "He's willing to talk, but he's terrified. He says Marcus isn't missing. Marcus is dead. Grant had him killed 8 weeks ago when Marcus started talking about getting out. Daniel found out through a third party. He's been waiting for someone to come asking questions, and he's been terrified that the next knock on his door would be the last one." Ronan's grip on the phone tightened. "Sarah, the custody filing is going through now. We have maybe 2 hours before a judge signs an order and sends deputies to find Elias." "I know. I'm recording Daniel's statement now. When I have enough for predication, I'm calling my SAC directly. If I can get an emergency federal filing before the state court acts, if." A pause. The sound of Sarah breathing. The sound of a woman who had spent her career building cases brick by brick, now being asked to build one at the speed of a controlled explosion. "Get the boy ready to move," she said. "If this doesn't work on my end, you need a plan." She hung up. Ronan stared at his phone, then he dialed Vasquez. "We're here," Vasquez said. "Kid's awake. He's been reading the notebook all night." "Is anyone outside? Any movement?" "Nothing. Town's dead. Listen to me. If I call and say the word south, you put Elias in the car and drive. Don't pack. Don't wait. Don't ask where. Just south. I'll send coordinates when I have them." "Understood." Ronan hung up. He looked at the room and saw what he always saw in the minutes before things went wrong. Men holding themselves still because stillness was the only thing they could control. At 7:01 a.m., Dex intercepted another call. His face, already drawn from a night without sleep, went a shade lighter. He pulled the laptop toward him, replayed the intercept, then looked at Ronan with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and dread. Adkins just dispatched 2 units, not to the clubhouse, to Finch. The word detonated in Ronan's skull. Finch, the safe house, Elias. How? Tommy was already on his feet, his hand reaching for the jacket draped over his bike's handlebar. I don't know. The call... Adkins told the units to check an apartment above a laundromat on Maple Street. That's the address. That's exactly the address. Who knew? Ronan's voice was a blade. Who knew the Finch location? Us. Vasquez. Murray. Dex was scrolling frantically. That's it! Unless someone talked, or unless someone was followed. Tommy's voice was flat, dead level. The voice of a man who had seen betrayal before and recognized its shape the way a surgeon recognizes a tumor. Ronan was already dialing. Vasquez picked up on the first ring. Get him out. Now. South. Ronan, there's a... Now! The line went silent. Then, moving. Ronan grabbed his jacket from the workbench. Tommy, Harker, with me. Dex, stay here with Lena and Mara. Kessler and Klein on the door. He was moving as he spoke, the words compressed by urgency into something that sounded less like orders and more like breathing. Involuntary, essential, the body's response to threat. 3 bikes, 3 riders. The garage door rolled up with a screech that split the dawn quiet, and the Harleys exploded onto the street with a roar that bounced off the empty storefronts and shattered the silence of Carver Falls like a fist through glass. Finch was 22 miles east. The road was straight, flat, and empty in the early morning, the fields on either side white with frost, the sky a pale gray threatening nothing and promising nothing. Ronan rode at 90, then 100, the wind tearing at his face and hands, the bike shuddering beneath him at speeds that turned the engine note from a rumble to a scream. Tommy and Harker flanked him, their headlights cutting white lines through the dawn. Ronan's phone was in his jacket pocket. He couldn't check it at this speed. He couldn't call Sarah. He couldn't do anything except ride and trust that Vasquez had moved fast enough, that the minutes between Dex's intercept and the dispatch of those units had been enough, that a 13-year-old boy in a crimson notebook were already on the road heading south, instead of sitting in the back of a sheriff's cruiser heading into the machinery that Grant Voss had built to swallow evidence whole. They hit Finch in 14 minutes. The town was the kind of place that exists between other places. A gas station, a dollar store, a post office, a row of houses that had been built in the 50s and maintained just enough to qualify as standing. The laundromat was on Maple Street, a squat concrete building with a faded sign and a plate glass window reflecting the gray sky. The apartment above it was accessed by an exterior staircase on the side of the building. The staircase door was open. Ronan killed the engine and was off the bike before it fully stopped, the kickstand gouging the asphalt as he swung his leg over and crossed the sidewalk in 3 strides. He took the stairs 2 at a time, boots hammering on the metal treads, and pushed through the open door into the apartment. Empty. The cot where Elias had slept was still warm. A glass of water sat on the counter, half full. The bathroom light was on, but no Elias, no Vasquez, no Murray. Ronan's phone buzzed. A text from Vasquez. 3 words. Clear. Heading south. He exhaled. The breath came out of him in a rush that left his chest hollow, and he braced one hand against the kitchen counter because, for one moment, his legs didn't feel reliable. The relief was physical, chemical, a flood of something that loosened every muscle that had been locked tight since Dex said the word Finch. Then he heard the sirens, distant but closing. Coming from the west, from the direction of the county road, from the direction that Grant's corrupted deputies would approach. Ronan moved to the window and looked down at the street. Tommy and Harker were still on their bikes, engines idling, heads turned toward the sound. Ronan? Tommy's voice carried up through the open staircase door. 2 minutes, maybe less. Ronan came down the stairs fast. His mind was running the calculation. The apartment was clean. There was nothing to find, nothing that connected to Elias or the notebook. But 3 Iron Ledger bikes parked outside an apartment that was the subject of a law enforcement dispatch would raise questions that nobody could afford to answer. Move. 3 engines roared. 3 bikes peeled away from the curb and cut east on Maple, then south on a residential street that connected to a farm road that connected to nothing. Open land, frozen fields, a sky that was beginning to turn from gray to pale blue as the sun crawled above the horizon. They rode for 3 miles before Ronan slowed and pulled off onto a dirt track that led to an abandoned grain elevator. The structure loomed against the sky, a concrete cylinder 50 feet tall, stained with weather and age, surrounded by a rusted fence that had collapsed in sections. They killed the engines behind the elevator, out of sight from the road, and sat in the sudden silence with their exhausts ticking and their hearts hammering and the cold morning air burning in their lungs. Ronan's phone rang. "Sarah, I have it," she said, and her voice carried something he hadn't heard from her before. The barely controlled intensity of a woman who has just kicked open a door that was supposed to stay closed. "Daniel Weir gave me everything. Truck schedules, warehouse locations, names of guards, payment structures. And he told me about Marcus. His brother was killed on Grant's orders by a man named Vincent Hale, who runs security for North Line Transport. Daniel has text messages, voicemails, photographs, enough for warrants." "How long?" "I've already called my SAC. She's waking up a federal magistrate right now. If we get the warrant signed in the next hour, I can have agents at those warehouses before noon. Grant knows we moved Elias. He sent deputies to Finch." A sharp intake of breath. "Is the boy safe?" "On the road, heading south. Keep him moving. I need 1 more hour. If I can get federal holds placed on Grant's assets and a federal arrest warrant issued before the state court acts on the custody order, the federal filing supersedes. State loses jurisdiction. 1 hour. 1 hour. Ronan, don't go anywhere near Grant. Don't go anywhere near the clubhouse. Stay invisible until I call you." She hung up. Ronan put the phone in his pocket and looked at Tommy and Harker. The morning sun was hitting the grain elevator now, casting a long shadow across the frozen field. And in that shadow, the 3 men and their bikes looked like remnants of something ancient and irreconcilable, outlaws waiting for the law to catch up with justice. 1 hour, Ronan said. Tommy lit a cigarette. "That's a long time." It was. Every minute felt like 10. Ronan sat on his bike with his hands on the handlebars and his eyes on the road, watching for dust, for headlights, for any sign that the machinery Grant had set in motion was reaching toward them across the frozen landscape. At 8:14 a.m., Dex called from the garage. "The custody order is signed. Judge Morrison. He issued it 12 minutes ago. Grant's lawyer is already on the phone with the sheriff's department coordinating pickup. They won't find him. They'll find the clubhouse empty and they'll start looking. Ronan, they're going to issue a bolo. For Elias, for Lena, for all of us. Grand theft auto if they can make it stick, custodial interference for sure, maybe kidnapping depending on how Grant frames it. Let them look." At 8:31 a.m., Dex called again. "Grant just called Adkins. He's furious. The apartment in Finch was empty. The clubhouse is empty. He told Adkins to, and this is a direct quote from The Intercept, find the boy or everything falls apart." Ronan closed his eyes. Everything falls apart. The architecture of lies, the shell companies, the corrupted law enforcement, the warehouses full of people, all of it depended on silencing a 13-year-old who had done nothing more radical than paying attention. At 8:47 a.m., Vasquez texted coordinates. He'd crossed the county line with Elias and was parked at a rest stop 60 miles south. The boy was safe. The notebook was with him. Murray was standing watch. At 9:03 a.m., Sarah called. "Warrants are signed. 4 warehouses, North Line Transport's offices, Grant Voss's residence, his charity headquarters, and a federal arrest warrant for Grant Voss on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and human trafficking." Ronan didn't move. He sat on his bike in the shadow of an abandoned grain elevator in the middle of a frozen field, and he let the words settle into him the way rain settles into dry earth. Slowly, completely, reaching the places that had been parched. FBI and HSI are mobilizing now. First teams hit the warehouses at 10 a.m. Grant will be arrested at his home or his office, wherever they find him first. The federal filing supersedes the state custody order. I've already had the U.S. Attorney's Office contact Judge Morrison's clerk. Elias stays where he is. The sergeant, Adkins. Included in the warrant, along with 2 other county deputies whose names Daniel Weir provided. Ronan breathed. Ronan. Sarah's voice changed, softened, though soft wasn't the right word. It was the voice she'd used at Walter Reed, the voice that existed between professional and personal, between the agent and the woman. You should know that when this goes public, and it will go public today, your club's involvement will come out. The interceptions, the unauthorized entry at the lodge. There will be questions. There may be charges. I know. I'll do what I can. I know that too. She hung up. Ronan looked at Tommy. The old man was leaning against his bike, smoking, watching the road with the patience of someone who has learned that the hardest moments are never the ones with gunfire. They're the ones with waiting and uncertainty and the slow, grinding knowledge that you've done everything you can and it still might not be enough. It's done, Ronan said. Tommy took a long drag, exhaled, and looked at the sky. Nothing's done until it's done, brother. At 9:58 a.m., Ronan's phone buzzed with a news alert that Dex had set up to monitor local feeds. A breaking report from the county's largest news station. Federal agents were executing search warrants at multiple locations across the region. The Ridgecrest Community Trust was named. Grant Voss was named. The words human trafficking investigation appeared in the headline. And just like that, the cathedral of reputation that Grant had spent decades constructing began to crack. At 10:07 a.m., Dex called. Agents are at the Garrett Farm warehouse. They found people, Ronan. 43 individuals. Locked inside. Cots. Padlocks. Exactly what Lena described. Ronan put his hand on the gas tank of his Harley. The metal was cold but warming slowly in the sun, and he could feel the machine beneath him. Dormant, patient, an instrument of distance and freedom that had carried him through every version of himself he'd ever been. He pressed his palm flat against the tank and held it there, anchoring himself to something real while the magnitude of what was unfolding settled over him. 43 people, in one warehouse, and there were 4 more locations. At 10:22 a.m., another text from Dex. Grant Voss has been arrested at his residence, taken into federal custody without incident. Without incident. 2 words that covered the end of an empire, the handcuffs, the Miranda, the walk to the federal car, the last look at a house built on suffering. Without incident, as if the entire machinery of deception could be dismantled as quietly as it had been constructed. At 10:34 a.m., Ronan called Vasquez. Bring Elias to the Carver Falls garage. It's safe. Then he started his engine, and Tommy started his, and Harker started his, and 3 Harleys rolled out from behind the grain elevator onto the farm road, turning west toward Carver Falls, riding into a morning that had broken open like something that had been sealed too long. Bright, cold, and carrying the unmistakable quality of an ending that wasn't yet an ending, because the boy still hadn't seen his mother, and the mother still hadn't held her son. And until that happened, nothing was finished. And in the back office of a garage in Carver Falls, Lena Voss sat on the edge of a cot with her hands clasped and her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. Because Mara had told her that Elias was coming, that he was safe, that it was almost over, and Lena had nodded and said nothing, because she had learned in 4 months of captivity that hope is the most dangerous thing a person can carry, and she would not allow herself to feel it until she could feel her son's arms around her neck, and know, not believe, not hope, but know, that the lies had finally stopped. The car pulled into the alley behind the Carver Falls garage at 11:43 a.m. A gray sedan, unremarkable, dust on the fenders, a crack running diagonally across the windshield that caught the midday sun and split it into 2 uneven halves of light. Vasquez was driving. Murray sat in the passenger seat with his hand resting on the door handle, scanning the alley with the vigilance of a man who hadn't slept in 26 hours and was running on something deeper than caffeine. In the back seat, Elias Voss sat with the crimson notebook on his lap, both hands pressed flat against its cover, His face turned toward the window, watching the garage approach with an expression that held no excitement, no anticipation, nothing that resembled the reaction of a child about to be reunited with his mother. Because Elias had spent too long in the space between hoping and knowing to let himself cross that distance before the evidence was in front of him. Ronan was standing at the side entrance when the car stopped. He'd been standing there for 19 minutes, which was 18 minutes longer than necessary, but something in him needed to be the first thing the boy saw when the door opened. Not a stranger. Not an institution. The man who had made a promise in a clubhouse that smelled like burnt coffee and kept it across a night that had tried to break every bone in the promise's body. The car door opened. Elias stepped out. He looked at Ronan, and Ronan looked at him, and for a moment neither moved. A pause that contained everything that had happened since 7:14 yesterday morning and everything that was about to happen in the next 60 seconds. "She's inside," Ronan said. Elias nodded. He walked past Ronan through the side door into the garage. His steps were measured, not slow, not fast, the deliberate pace of someone who has been moving toward this moment for 4 months and will not be rushed by its arrival. He passed the bikes, past the workbench, past Tommy, who stood against the wall with an unlit cigarette and eyes that were wet for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, and he stopped at the office door. It was open. Lena was standing on the other side, 3 feet away, her hand on the doorframe, her bare feet on the cold concrete, her face doing something that no word in any language has ever adequately described. The expression of a mother who has spent 122 days not knowing if she would ever see her child again, and is now seeing him. Elias didn't run to her. He walked. He crossed those 3 feet with the same measured steps, and when he reached her, he put his arms around her waist and pressed his face against her shoulder and held on with the quiet, total, unshakable grip of someone who has been carrying the weight of 2 people's survival on his own and is finally setting it down. Lena's hands came up to his head. She held him there, one hand on the back of his skull, one pressed between his shoulder blades. And she closed her eyes and bent her face into his hair and breathed. Just breathed. The sound of it filled the small office like something sacred and private. The sound of a woman remembering what it felt like to hold the thing she loved most in a world that had tried to take it from her. Nobody in the garage spoke. Nobody moved. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The space heaters hummed. Outside, a car passed on the main road, its tires hissing on wet asphalt, the sound fading into the distance like a sentence left unfinished. The bikers stood in their various positions around the bay. Tommy by the wall, Dex at his laptop, Kessler near the rolling door, Harker and Klein flanking the entrance, and they watched the doorway of that back office with the expressions of men who had spent their lives protecting things they couldn't name and were now seeing, in the arms of a mother and her son, the shape of what they'd been protecting all along. Mara was the first to move. She stepped forward, gently touched Lena's shoulder, and guided both of them to the cot, where they sat down together, Elias still pressed against his mother's side, her arm around him, the notebook on his lap between them like a bridge connecting what she'd endured with what he'd documented. "Let me check you over," Mara said to Elias, and the boy submitted to the assessment with the patience of someone accustomed to being examined: blood pressure, pulse, pupils, the gentle probing of a nurse's hands checking for damage that might not be visible. He was dehydrated. His blood sugar was low. There was a bruise on his right forearm that he couldn't explain or wouldn't, but he was whole, intact, functional in the way that children who have been forced to become their own protectors are functional, operating at a level of competence that is simultaneously impressive and devastating. "He needs food," Mara said to Ronan, "real food, and sleep, both of them." "There's a diner on the main road," Kessler offered, then looked uncertain, as if volunteering information in this room required permission he hadn't earned. "Go," Ronan said. "Get whatever they have. Coffee for everyone. And Kessler." The young man stopped at the door. "Thank you." Kessler blinked. The word landed on him like something he'd been waiting to hear without knowing it, and he nodded once, quickly, and left before anyone could see the effect it had on his face. The hours that followed were not dramatic. They were the slow, grinding hours that come after a crisis. The decompression, the reckoning, The gradual transition from survival mode to something that might eventually resemble normal. Dex monitored the news feeds and intercepted communications with decreasing urgency as the federal operation expanded. By early afternoon, agents had secured all 4 warehouse locations Lena had described, plus a 5th that Daniel Weir had identified during his statement. The total number of individuals recovered from the facilities was 117. 117 people who had been living in concrete buildings with padlocked doors, sleeping on cots, working without pay, existing in a shadow economy that had generated millions of dollars for a man who smiled for cameras and cut ribbons at food banks. The number sat in the garage like a stone too heavy to lift. 117, each one a life, each one a story that would have to be told, processed, investigated, documented. Each one a human being who had disappeared into a system designed to make disappearance invisible, sustained by the same public trust that had made Grant Voss untouchable. Ronan sat at the workbench and listened to Dex read the updates, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort but from moral effort, from the sustained expenditure of giving a damn in a world that makes giving a damn expensive. His hands were on the workbench, palms down, the wood scarred and stained beneath them, and he studied the grain of it the way a man studies a map after a journey, tracing the lines with his eyes, remembering the route. At 2:15 p.m., Sarah called. Her voice was different, tired but carrying an undertone of something that might have been satisfaction, though satisfaction felt too clean a word for what any of them were feeling. Grant Voss has been formally charged. Wire fraud, money laundering, human trafficking, conspiracy. The U.S. attorney is adding charges as the investigation expands. His attorney requested bail and was denied. Flight risk, danger to witnesses. He's in federal custody and he's staying there. Adkins. Arrested this morning, along with deputies Harmon and Streck. Daniel Weir's testimony, combined with Dex's intercept data, which, for the record, I will never officially acknowledge having seen, gave us enough to build parallel construction. Everything we found at the warehouses corroborates. The case is solid. The custody order. Vacated, the federal filing superseded, and once the trafficking charges were public, Judge Morrison withdrew the order and recused himself. There's going to be an investigation into whether Morrison had prior knowledge of Grant's operations. Daniel Weir mentioned the judge's name in a context I'm not ready to discuss yet. Lena and Elias? They're witnesses now. Federal protection is available if they want it. But honestly, Ronan, the safest place for them right now might be exactly where they are. Ronan looked at the office doorway. Lena was sitting on the cot with a plate of diner food on her lap. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, hammers the kind of American diner breakfast that exists as a form of comfort, regardless of the time of day. Elias was beside her, eating with the focused intensity of a boy whose body had been running on empty for longer than he'd admitted. Between them, the crimson notebook sat closed, its purpose fulfilled, its contents already absorbed into the formal machinery of federal evidence. Sarah. Yeah. Thank you. A pause. The weight of 3 years of silence, compressed into 2 words and the space after them. You're welcome, Ronan, and you should know what you did, what your people did. It's going to come out. The press will have the broad strokes by tonight. An outlaw motorcycle club rescuing a kidnapped woman and triggering a federal trafficking investigation. That's a story that writes itself. It won't all be flattering. It doesn't need to be. No, but it'll be true, and sometimes that's enough. She hung up. Ronan put the phone down and sat with it for a moment, his hand resting on the workbench, his eyes unfocused, his mind processing the shape of what had happened and what it would cost. Because there would be costs. Sarah had been honest about that. The interceptions, the unauthorized entry at the lodge, the removal of Lena without legal authority. These were actions that existed outside the law, regardless of the moral imperative that had driven them. The Iron Ledger would face scrutiny. Members might face charges. The club's operations, legitimate and otherwise, would be examined under a microscope that none of them had invited and none of them could avoid. Tommy appeared beside him. The old man set a mug of coffee on the workbench, fresh, from the diner, hot enough that steam rose from the surface in a thin column that twisted and dissolved in the fluorescent light. "You're thinking about what comes next," Tommy said. "Always." "Stop." Ronan looked at him. Tommy's face was lined and weathered and carried the permanent expression of a man who had outlived the things he loved and kept going anyway, not out of optimism, but out of a stubborn refusal to let the world have the last word. His eyes were steady. His cigarette was, for once, absent, tucked away somewhere, forgotten or deliberately set aside. "Today isn't about what comes next," Tommy said. "Today is about what just happened. A kid walked through our door, we did our job, that's it. The rest of it, the lawyers, the charges, the newspapers, that's tomorrow's problem, and we've survived plenty of tomorrows." Ronan looked at his coffee, then at Tommy, then at the office, where Lena was wiping Elias's face with a paper napkin the way mothers wipe children's faces, tenderly, instinctively, the gesture outliving the necessity, the hand continuing to move after the face is clean because the touch itself is the point. "Yeah," Ronan said. "Okay." The afternoon faded into early evening. The November sun, which had never fully committed to brightness, withdrew behind a bank of clouds, and the temperature dropped as the light changed from pale gold to blue-gray to the particular shade of indigo that precedes a winter night. The garage settled into a different rhythm, quieter, slower, the mechanical urgency of the previous 24 hours replaced by something that felt almost domestic. Dex closed his laptop for the first time in 18 hours and fell asleep in a folding chair with his glasses still on. Kessler swept the floor, not because it needed sweeping, but because his body needed to do something, and sweeping was the simplest form of useful motion. Harker and Klein stood down from watch and sat on their bikes in the bay, talking in low voices about nothing important. The weather, a part Klein needed for his transmission, a bar in a town neither of them could remember the name of. Mara spent 2 hours with Lena, conducting a more thorough medical assessment now that the immediate crisis had passed. The injection marks on Lena's arms were consistent with a sedative. Mara couldn't determine the specific drug without lab work, but the pattern of use she described, administered every 2 to 3 days, producing 12 to 18 hours of semi-consciousness, suggested a benzodiazepine or a barbiturate, something designed to keep the mind compliant without shutting the body down. The bruising was older, layered, a palimpsest of violence that told its own chronological story. Mara documented everything, photographs, measurements, notes, with the systematic thoroughness of a professional who understood that this documentation would eventually become part of a case file and needed to be unimpeachable. When she emerged from the office, she found Ronan sitting alone at the workbench in the half-dark. The fluorescent lights had been turned off. Only the security light near the rolling door was still on, casting a weak yellow glow that turned the garage into a landscape of shadows and chrome. Mara sat on the workbench beside him, not across from him, beside him. The distinction mattered, and Ronan felt it, the physical fact of someone choosing proximity, choosing to occupy the same space without agenda or demand. "She'll need therapy," Mara said. "Real, sustained, professional help. What she experienced, the captivity, the drugging, the isolation, that's not something you recover from with time and willpower. That's structural damage. We'll find someone. I already have a name, a trauma specialist in the city, someone who's worked with trafficking survivors. I'll make the call tomorrow." Ronan nodded, then after a pause. "And the boy?" Mara was quiet for a moment. The security light hummed. Outside, wind moved through the empty street, carrying the sound of somewhere else. A distant highway, a train, the anonymous noise of a world that continued regardless of what happened in garages and lodges and apartments above laundromats. "The boy is extraordinary," Mara said. "And that's the problem. He's 13 years old and he functions like a field operative. He observes, documents, analyzes, plans, executes. He walked into a room full of bikers and delivered an intelligence briefing that most adults couldn't match. That's not normal. That's a survival adaptation. He built that skill set because he had to, because nobody around him was safe enough to rely on, so he became his own safety." She paused. Her voice softened. Not weaker, but carrying a different frequency, the way a note changes when you play it on a different string. He's going to need help learning how to be a kid again, how to trust adults to handle things, how to put the notebook down. Ronan thought about the notebook. 47 lies in 1 week, documented in small, neat handwriting by a boy who had taught himself to be invisible. The truck routes, the license plates, the hand-drawn maps with their X's and arrows, the 3 words on page 37, "Where's Mom?" underlined twice. "He won't want to put it down," Ronan said. "No, he won't, because the notebook kept him alive. It gave him purpose when everything else was falling apart. Letting go of it will feel like letting go of the only thing that worked." Mara looked at Ronan. "Sound familiar?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew she wasn't just talking about Elias. She was talking about the club, about the bikes, about the leather and the patches and the brotherhood. The structures that men build around their damage, because structure is what keeps the damage from spreading, and letting go of it feels like letting go of survival itself. "He's going to be okay," Mara said. "Not right away, not easily, but eventually, because he has something that a lot of damaged people don't have." "What?" "Someone who came when he called." The words settled into the garage and stayed there, quiet and heavy, filling the space between the bikes and the shadows, and the 2 people sitting on a workbench in the dark. At 7 p.m., Ronan made a decision. He gathered everyone in the main bay: Tommy, Dex, Kessler, Harker, Klein, Mara, Vasquez, Murray. Lena and Elias stayed in the office. The door opened so they could hear, but the conversation was for the club. "Here's where we are," Ronan said. He stood in the center of the bay with his hands at his sides, his leather jacket zipped against the cold, his face carrying the particular gravity of a man about to discuss the price of doing the right thing. "The federal case against Grant Voss is moving. The warehouses are secured. The people inside them are being processed and will receive federal protection. Lena and Elias are safe. That's the good part." He paused. "Let the good part sit for a moment before the rest. The other part is that our involvement will come out. The entry at the lodge, the intercepted communications, removing Lena. The investigation into the Iron Ledger's activities will be thorough, and it will not be friendly. Some of us may face charges. All of us will face questions. The club's reputation, whatever version of it existed before last night, is going to change." Nobody spoke. The silence was not the silence of men waiting for instructions. It was the silence of men who had already done the math and arrived at the same answer and were waiting to hear it spoken aloud. "I want to be clear," Ronan continued. "Nobody here was ordered to do what they did. Every man in this room made a choice, and choices have consequences. If anyone wants to distance themselves from what happened, from the club, from this situation, from me, I won't hold it against you." "There's no shame in self-preservation," Tommy snorted. It was the most vocal response he'd given all day, and it communicated everything: dismissal, loyalty, the absolute refusal of a man who had already lost everything he had to lose to pretend that self-preservation was a priority. "Ronan, Dex one," Dex said from his corner. His glasses were crooked, his hair was matted, his neck tattoo looked darker against skin that hadn't seen proper rest in 30 hours. "I committed approximately a dozen federal crimes in the last 24 hours. If I was interested in self-preservation, I picked the wrong career. And the wrong club." A murmur went through the room. Not laughter, something quieter than that, something that existed between acknowledgement and solidarity, the sound of men recognizing that they were in something together, and that together was the only version of this that any of them wanted. Kessler raised his hand, literally raised it, like a kid in a classroom, and the gesture was so earnest and so out of place that it broke something in the room's tension. "For the record," he said, "I joined this club 3 months ago because I didn't have anywhere else to go. And in the last 24 hours, I've been part of something that actually mattered. So whatever comes next, I'm here." Ronan looked at the young man and saw something he recognized, the expression of a person who has been searching for purpose and has just found it in the last place they expected to look. It was the same expression Ronan had seen in the mirror the day he'd patched into the Iron Ledger. The same expression he'd seen on Elias's face when Mara told him they were going to find his mother. The particular look of someone who has found their people and knows it with a certainty that doesn't require explanation. Then we stay together, Ronan said, and we deal with whatever comes. The meeting ended without ceremony. Men returned to their positions, their bikes, their coffee. The garage resumed its quiet rhythm, the space heaters humming, the security light casting its yellow glow, the night settling over Carver Falls with the cold indifference of a season that doesn't care about justice or injustice, about rescue or captivity, about the small, fierce acts of loyalty that happen in garages and clubhouses in towns that most people will never visit. At 9 p.m., Ronan walked to the office. Lena was lying on the cot, asleep, truly asleep, her breathing deep and even, her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been since she'd walked out of that lodge barefoot in the snow. Mara's jacket was still draped over her shoulders. The thermal blanket was pulled to her chin. Elias was sitting on the floor beside the cot with his back against the wall and the notebook in his lap. But he wasn't reading it. He was staring at the wall across from him with the unfocused gaze of someone whose mind is processing something too large for a single moment to contain. Ronan sat down beside him. The concrete floor was cold through his jeans. His knees protested. His back ached. Everything ached. The scar, the joints, the accumulated physical toll of a night spent riding through a snowstorm and crouching behind trees and running up metal staircases and sitting on a motorcycle behind a grain elevator, waiting for the world to decide whether it was going to be just or not. They sat in silence for a while. The office was small enough that their shoulders were almost touching. The cot creaked softly as Lena shifted in her sleep. "I didn't think it would work," Elias said. His voice was different now. Younger, thinner, stripped of the composure that had carried him through the clubhouse and the notebook and the long night alone in the apartment in Finch. He sounded like what he was, a 13-year-old boy, exhausted, overwhelmed, sitting on a cold floor next to a man he'd met 28 hours ago. "Neither did I," Ronan said. Elias looked at him. "Really? Really? I'm a mechanic who runs a motorcycle club in a town nobody's heard of. This isn't what I'm built for." "Then why did you do it?" Ronan considered the question. He could have given a simple answer. Because it was right, because someone had to, because the club's code demanded it. All of those were true, but none of them were the truth, and the boy beside him had spent months learning to distinguish between the two. "Because you walked through the door," Ronan said, "and you weren't asking for much. You were asking for someone to believe you. That's the easiest thing in the world to give someone, and you couldn't find a single person to give it to you. That made me angry. And when I get angry about the right things, I tend to do something about it." Elias was quiet. He looked down at the notebook in his lap, ran his fingers along the crimson cover, traced the edges that were worn soft from months of handling. "Do I have to give this back?" he asked. "The FBI lady said they'll need it." "They'll need it for the case, but it's yours. It was always yours." "It's just—" Elias stopped. Started again. "It's the only thing I had. When everything else was—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ronan reached over and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The leather of his jacket creaked with the movement. His hand was heavy, calloused, scarred across the knuckles from a life of engines and weather and the occasional fight that couldn't be avoided. But the weight of it on the boy's narrow shoulder was the gentlest thing Ronan Creed had done in years, and he held it there for a long moment, saying nothing, because some things are communicated through pressure and proximity and the simple act of being present, and words would only get in the way. Elias leaned, slightly, barely, almost imperceptibly, into the weight of that hand, and Ronan held steady, and Lena breathed on the cot above them, and the garage hummed its mechanical lullaby of heaters and fluorescent lights and cooling engines. Later, much later, after Elias had fallen asleep on the floor and Ronan had covered him with a blanket and gone back to the main bay, Ronan stepped outside. The night was clear now, the storm having passed through and left behind a sky scattered with stars and a cold so deep it felt architectural, like the air itself had been built from ice and silence. The Harleys were parked in their row, chrome catching starlight, exhaust pipes silver in the dark. Everything was still. Tommy was already outside, leaning against the garage wall, smoking his last cigarette of the day. The ember glowed and faded, a small orange pulse against the darkness. Ronan stood beside him. They looked at the sky. The silence between them was different from the silences earlier. Not tense, not strategic, not the silence of men waiting for danger. This was the silence of men at the end of something, standing in the cold, letting the quiet fill the spaces that the day had hollowed out. 117 people, Tommy said. Yeah. In cages, while the whole county called that man a hero. Yeah. Tommy smoked. The ember traveled to his lips and back, a tiny arc of light. We did right, Ronan. Whatever comes next. Whatever it costs. We did right. Ronan looked at the row of bikes, at the chrome-reflecting stars, at the leather jackets hung over handlebars like shed skins, the patches facing outward, the Iron Ledger's insignia, a book made of iron, open, the pages blank. He'd never thought about the symbolism of those blank pages before. Now he did. A book with nothing written in it, a ledger waiting to be filled. The story not finished, the accounts not settled, the pages open for whatever came next. Yeah, Ronan said. We did. Inside the garage, Mara was covering Elias with a second blanket. Dex was backing up every file he'd collected to 3 separate encrypted drives. Kessler was washing coffee mugs in the bathroom sink with the earnest dedication of a man who has found his place and intends to earn it through every small act available to him. Harker and Klein were checking oil levels on the bikes, preparing for the ride back, whenever that would be, wherever back would mean after everything that had changed. And in the office, on a cot in a converted auto garage in a town called Carver Falls, Lena Voss slept with her hand hanging over the edge, her fingers resting on her son's shoulder as he slept on the floor below her, the crimson notebook between them. Closed now, its work done, its 47 lies answered by a truth that had traveled through snowstorms and mountain roads and the long, unlit corridors of a system that had failed and a brotherhood that hadn't. Outside, the cold pressed against the garage walls like something trying to get in. But the walls held. The heaters hummed. The bikes stood patient in their row, engines cold, tanks full, ready to carry their riders wherever the next road led. And the doors of the Iron Ledger, the real doors, not the ones made of wood and rusted hinges, but the ones made of loyalty and damage, and the stubborn, imperfect, unshakable decision to stand between the vulnerable and the dark, remained open.